All right, here we go, guys. We are on another day of reading our Wayside School is Falling Down. If you guys are hanging out with me, we are on chapter 9 and chapter 10 today. Um, so we are going to be looking at chapter 9, which is Mush. Warning, do not read this story right after eating. In fact, don't read it right before eating either. In fact, just to be safe, don't read this story if you're ever planning to eat again. Miss Mush wiped her hand on her apron. She smiled at the children who were lined up at the cafeteria. It warmed her heart to see how much they liked her food. Mauricia was first in line. "And what would you like today, Mauricia?" Miss Mush asked. She knew the name of every child in Wayside School. Mauricia looked at the sign. "Special today, mushroom surprise." "Just milk," said Mauricia. "I brought my lunch." Miss Mush smiled and gave Mauricia a carton of milk. Joy was next in line. "And what would you like, Joy?" asked Miss Mush. "Milk," said Joy. Miss Mush smiled and gave Joy a carton of milk. "And what would you like, Jason?" "Milk, please," said Jason. "Just milk," said Damien. "Milk," said DJ. "Milk," said Leslie. It was almost Ron's turn. He hadn't brought a lunch. He normally brought a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to school, but there hadn't been a single slice of bread in his house this morning. "I know," his mother had said. "I'll give you some money and you can buy a nice hot lunch for Miss Mush." She thought it was a brilliant idea. "Can't I just have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich without the bread?" Ron had asked. Now he looked up at the sign. "Special today? Mushroom surprise." He wished he weren't so hungry. This was the 18th day in a row that the special was mushroom surprise. It was called mushroom surprise because it would have been a surprise if anybody had ever ordered it. No one ever did, except Lewis, of course. That's why they had it for 18 days. There was always plenty left over. "Milk," said Terence. "Milk," said Cherry. "Milk," said Calvin. "Milk, please," said Bibi. "And what would you like today, Ron?" asked Miss Mush. Ron took a breath. "Mushroom surprise," he squeaked. Tears of joy filled Miss Mush's eyes. She blew her nose on her apron, then said, "One mushroom surprise coming right up." Tears came to Ron's eyes too, but for a different reason. He looked at the mushroom surprise. It was sort of green. So was Ron. Miss Mush proudly dumped a hot lump of mushroom surprise on a paper plate and handed it to Ron. He put it on his tray, then pushed it over to the cash register, where he paid for it. The news quickly spread around the cafeteria, then up and down the stairs and out to the playground. "Ron ordered the mushroom surprise. Ron ordered the mushroom surprise." Mrs. Jules was sitting in the teacher's lounge on the 12th floor when Bibi burst into the room. All the teachers were shocked to see her. "Bibi, you're not allowed in here," said Mrs. Jules. "This is a secret place." "Ron ordered the mushroom surprise," Bibi shouted, and then she ran back to the cafeteria. As Ron sat down at a table, 87 kids crowded around him to watch him eat. "I wonder what the surprise is," said Dee Dee. She had the best view. She was pushed right up alongside Ron's chair. "Maybe it tastes good," said Leslie. "Maybe that's the surprise." "No, I think it's called mushroom surprise because after you eat it, it's a surprise if you don't die," said Mac. "Lewis eats it. He's not dead," said Jason. "Lewis has been eating Miss Mush's food for so long, he's immune to it," said Allison. Ron dug his plastic fork into the goop. He raised it to his mouth. Dana covered her eyes. "I can't watch," she explained. Ron opened his mouth wide. The fork entered. He brought the fork out again. It was empty. Ron chewed twice, then swallowed. "He ate it," Dee Dee announced for those who couldn't see. Stephen screamed. Said Ron. "Not too bad. It sort of tastes like a mixture of bananas and spinach." "What's the surprise?" asked Dee Dee. Ron looked at Dee Dee. His face flushed and his eyes changed colors. His whole body began to shake like a washing machine on the spin cycle. Dee Dee was afraid he was going to throw up. She tried to get away, but with everyone crowded around, there was no room for her to move. But Ron didn't throw up. He stood up, put his arms around Dee Dee's neck, and kissed her smack on the lips. He sat back down. His eyes returned to their normal color. "Yeah," said Dee Dee, wiping her mouth on her sleeve. "What's the matter?" asked Ron. "Don't you know what you just did?" asked Allison. He shrugged. "I ate some mushroom surprise. It wasn't bad. Sort of like a mixture of a hot dog and grape jelly. I wonder what the surprise is." He dug his plastic fork back into the goop. Everyone ran away. When Mrs. Jules entered the cafeteria, no one was there except for Ron. He was sitting alone at a table eating mushroom surprise. Mrs. Jules sat down next to him. "Hi, Ron," she said. "So how does it taste? And what's the surprise?" Ron swallowed another mouthful. He looked at his teacher. His face flushed, and his eyes changed color. Chapter 10. Music. Benjamin still hadn't told anybody he wasn't Mark Miller. His grades had never been better. Mark Miller is a lot smarter than Benjamin Nushmat, he thought. When they chose teams for kickball, he was always the first one picked. Mark Miller is a better kicker than Benjamin Nushmat, he realized. The girls in the class liked him too. Mark Miller is better looking than Benjamin Nushmat, he decided. But unfortunately, he knew he had to tell Mrs. Jules his real name. He sighed, then slowly raised his hand. Mrs. Jules gave him a tambourine. He had been so busy thinking about his problem, he hadn't noticed that Mrs. Jules was passing out musical instruments. She had just asked, who would like the tambourine? So, when he raised his hand, she gave it to him. Who would like the triangle? Asked Mrs. Jules. Joe raised his hand, and Mrs. Jules gave it to him. Why is it called a triangle? Asked Joe. I don't know, said Mrs. Jules. Maybe it's because it's shaped like a triangle, suggested John. No, that can't be it, said Mrs. Jules. Then the tambourine would have to be called a circle. Maybe it was invented by a person named Joe Triangle, said Rondi. That's probably it, said Mrs. Jules. She held up the next instrument. It was a glockenspiel. Who would like the glockenspiel? She asked. Sherry raised her hand. Nobody asked why it was called a glockenspiel. It was obvious. Mrs. Jules gave the bells to Stephen. Why are they called bells? He asked. Nobody knew. Joy got the bongo drums. Todd got the bass drum. Jenny snared the snare drum. And Leslie got the kettle drum. When they banged on them, it hurt everybody else's eardrums. Mrs. Jules gave one cymbal to Calvin and the other cymbal to Bibi. DJ got the gong. The three Erics got kazoos. Mrs. Jules shouted, Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. The children all played their instruments. They shook, rattled, rocked, and rolled. Joy bonged her bongos. DJ gonged his gong. Sherry glockened her glockenspiel. Stephen jingled his bells. Calvin and Bibi slapped their cymbals together, and Joy's triangle went ting. But something didn't sound right. What's wrong, Mark? Mrs. Jules shouted over the music. Why aren't you playing the tambourine? My name's not Mark, said Benjamin. It's Benjamin Nushmat. I'm sorry for not telling you before. What? Asked Mrs. Jules. I can't hear you. My name isn't Mark, he said. It's Benjamin. Louder, said Mrs. Jules. So everyone played louder. Todd bashed his bass drum. Leslie cooked on her kettle drum. Calvin and Bibi crashed their cymbals together, and Joe's triangle went ting. My name is Benjamin, shouted Benjamin. Mrs. Jules put her hand to her ear. Louder, she said. So everyone played louder. DJ kabonged his gong. Joy chongoed her bongos. Paul splacked his castanets. Jenny spaghettied her snare drum. Calvin and Bibi whammered their cymbals, and Joe's triangle went ting. My name's Benjamin Nushmat, hollered Benjamin Nushmat. Louder, yelled Mrs. Jules. So everyone played louder. The three Erics screamed into their kazoos. Calvin and Bibi ran to opposite sides of the room with their cymbals, then charged toward each other. Suddenly the door flew open, and a man entered. Benjamin had never seen him before. The whole class became very quiet. It was Mr. Kidswatter, the principal. Calvin and Bibi screeched to a halt just in time. Their cymbals were less than an inch apart. Is something the matter, Mr. Kidswatter? Asked Mrs. Jules. Several teachers have complained about your music, said Mr. Kidswatter. Their students are having trouble hearing. I understand, said Mrs. Jules. Good, said Mr. Kidswatter. He walked out of the room. Okay, you heard Mr. Kidswatter, said Mrs. Jules. We'll have to play louder so everyone can hear. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. They shook, rattled, rocked, and rolled. Benjamin frampled his tambourine. Excellent, Mark, shouted Mrs. Jules. He smiled. He had never played so well before. Mark Miller is a better musician than Benjamin Nushmat, he thought. And that is it for today. Another couple silly stories. All right. Make sure you check the next recording when it releases on Community 3's Google Classroom or on YouTube. Thank you.